So it's March 20th, 2023. Let's go back in time and see what happened today. 1602, we are sailing across the Indian Ocean. We are on our way to the Spice Islands. These islands are located on what we now call Indonesia, specifically on the island of Java. And back then they were known as the Maluku Islands, or the Banda Islands, and they grew spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. And these spices were very valuable in Europe. They added flavor to bland food. They were used in medicine and they were even used in religious ceremonies. And the Dutch had built several small forts on the islands, but it wasn't enough. So they decided to form the Dutch East India Company, also called VOC, which stands for Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, which translates into United East Indian Company. This was different than other trading companies because it was a mix between a trading company, an explorer, a navy, and a government. And this company would go on to become one of the biggest monopolies of all time, and they're responsible for some really bad stuff. I mean, there's a reason why they call it the Evil Empire. The VOC had the power to wage war, issue currency, make treaties, establish colonies, and most importantly, they were given a noble status by the Dutch government. With this new charter, the VOC started taking over more of Asia and even Africa. They took control of large areas of land around the Cape of Good Hope, where they established their own settlement, and they also began the enslavement of people from Africa and sent them to work on plantations in Asia. This company went on to become the largest and most powerful trading company of its time. In fact, at their peak, they had a larger navy than some countries. The Dutch East India Company became the blueprint for future monopolies and would directly influence the age of exploration. But let's move forward 140 years to Boston. It's the year 1760, and tensions are rising between Britain and its 13 colonies in North America. This tension will eventually lead to the American Revolution. But before that, Boston is going to burn down. The Great Fire of Boston started when 2 buildings caught fire on the night of March 20th, and quickly spread due to strong winds. It continued until the next day, burning down 85 buildings and destroying 40% of the city. The aftermath left 6,000 people homeless and caused about $2 million in damages. That's equivalent to about $5 million today. This wasn't the first time Boston burned. In 1630, much of the city was destroyed by a series of fires, as well as in 1676 during King Philip's War. But after the fire, things would start to look up for Boston. It would be rebuilt and become the epicenter of the growing rebellion against British rule. The fire itself didn't really cause the revolution, but it did play a role in helping to fuel the fire, no pun intended. Let's jump forward another 105 years to a little town in southern France called Elba. On this day in 1815, Napoleon returns from exile. Napoleon had been exiled to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, but he was able to negotiate his way out and return back to France. He would go on to briefly take control of France once again, and later abdicate, giving the throne to his son and leaving him to rule over France. But everyone knows that story. Or maybe not everyone. Basically, his second return to power was very short-lived, and it was actually a mistake. After returning to France, he learned that the country was never truly loyal to him, and after an unsuccessful military campaign, he would go back into exile for good. Some historians debate whether he ever really returned to power, or if he was just a figurehead controlled by others. But one thing is for sure. His legacy would live on for centuries. Let's fast forward to 1852. And on this day, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. Uncle Tom's Cabin is an anti-slavery novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This book sold over 300,000 copies in its first year, and was one of the best-selling books of its time. Many Northerners who had never really thought about slavery before picked up a copy and were shocked. It was said that when President Lincoln met Mrs. Stowe, he thanked her for writing the book that started the Civil War. While it was an exaggeration, the book definitely played a role in anti-slavery sentiments, but it was only the beginning. As the Civil War dragged on, many in the North began questioning whether they had done the right thing by starting the war. This book helped to restore their faith and support for the Union. Even though it had been decades since the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, there were still people alive who remembered reading it for the first time. So it's hard to imagine the impact it must have had on those people. Now let's travel to Berlin, Germany. It's the year 1916, and Albert Einstein is working on his theory of general relativity. His work is centered around finding a theory of gravity that would explain how massive objects move through space. He had already developed the special theory of relativity and was looking to build on that success. After years of hard work, he publishes his findings and fundamentally changes physics forever. His theory basically said that space and time intertwined in a four-dimensional continuum are not absolute, but are relative to the observer's frame of reference. This had a huge impact on our understanding of the universe and paved the way for modern physics. Without Einstein's theories, we wouldn't have spaceships, satellites, GPS, and nuclear energy. And his research inspired generations of scientists to come. Many of his scientific papers were published on this day, March 20th. Now let's travel across the world to Nagano, Japan. The year is 1999, and a hot air balloon is about to make history. This team of adventurers set off in a hot air balloon to circumnavigate the globe non-stop. This was no easy feat. They had to deal with high-altitude winds and weather conditions that could rip their balloon to shreds. They also had to worry about running out of fuel or having an accident mid-air. After 19 days and covering 45,000 kilometers, they landed safely in Nagano, Japan. This was the first time this had ever been done. And it took 3 attempts to make it happen. Their journey was documented by media outlets around the world and inspired millions. Unfortunately, their journey almost ended in tragedy when they landed in a Russian restricted zone and were detained for nearly 2 weeks. After being held for questioning, they were allowed to continue on to Japan and were greeted as heroes. The crew had proven that hot air balloons could cross oceans and continents without any problems. And this would open the door for future adventurers to follow in their footsteps. And that's all the major events that happened on March 20th. What do you think? Did you know that all these crazy events happened on this day? Which one was your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.